In the second part of this week's reading, we're talking about the actual making of our Constitution, which took place at the Philadelphia Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it's important to understand the type of people that were at this convention. There were 55 men from 12 of the 13 states. Most were wealthy planters and merchants who were dissatisfied with the economic turmoil that was happening under the Articles of Confederation. Most were college graduates, and some had had some political experience either in the state legislatures or as lawyers, things like that. Also, know that most were coastal residents from the larger cities, not the rural areas. And a lot of their concern was about property rights because the economic turmoil was not being resolved and they weren't able to protect their property. So those are the type of men that came together and why they came together. And ultimately, even though they came to revise the Articles of Confederation, they ended up moving forward and creating a new document that became our Constitution. They dealt with some major issues as they were writing this new document, the first of which was equality issues. Basically, the different states were arguing about how the states would be represented in the legislative body. Should they, give equal representation to each state, or should they base it on population? New Jersey put forward a plan that said that there should be equal representation in each state, which obviously benefited them because they were a state of smaller population. So then they would be on even footing with the larger states. Virginia, a state with a lot of people, countered and said that it should be based on population because the more people you have, the more say you should have. They went back and forth until Connecticut came forward with a compromise, which was also known as the Great Compromise. It said we should have a bicameral Congress. Bicameral means two houses. Cameral means houses. And one house would be based on the New Jersey plan, which is our Senate, which each state would get 2 representatives. And then one state, our House of Representatives, will be based on the Virginia plan, where representation is based on population. So, the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, solved the debate over representation in the legislative branch. Another issue in terms of representation was how to count slaves. Believe it or not, the Souths wanted to count slaves more because they had more of them and that would give them more representation. The North did not want to count slaves because they didn't have any. Ultimately, they came up with kind of one of the most shameful aspects of our original Constitution, the 3/5 Compromise, that said that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. This was ultimately removed by the 13th Amendment after the Civil War. And all decisions of who would vote and how political equality would be established was left to the states. So states could allow different people to vote based on their beliefs. Okay, so those are the equality issues that were discussed in the forming of our new Constitution. Then there were economic issues that had to be discussed. States were having tariffs on products being sold in other states. So tariffs are like taxes. So it'd be like if you were a citizen of Indiana and went to buy something in Illinois, you would have to pay an extra tax on it, which was making things very complicated. Paper money at that time was basically worthless. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, hadn't had power to raise any money, so they had to strengthen the economic powers of Congress. They gave Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. Interstate means between states, so states could no longer tax one another. Commerce means trade. And then they could raise an army, they could coin money, they could tax people, so the point was Congress would now have the power to stop all these economic problems, and the state would be limited when it came to economic issues. So that's how they resolved the economic problems that were facing the nation under the Articles of Confederation. And the last one was the individual rights issues. They did include some rights in the original Constitution. These were the main ones that you need to know about. They prohibited the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which is a lot of Latin, so I'll help you understand it. A habeas corpus writ means a document that says they have to present the body in court. Corpus referring to the body. And what that means is if you're going to be charged with a crime, they have to bring you into court and tell you what you're being charged with. Because under tyrannical or monarchical regimes, like under the King of England, people could just be thrown in court and not be told what they're being charged with. So they said that that was no longer allowed. There always has to be a writ of habeas corpus. They have to bring you into court and tell you what you're being charged with. There could also be no bills of attainder. Bills of attainder would be if Congress passed a bill punishing someone without a trial. They just said, we're going to throw this person in jail without a trial. That is not allowed. Also, there could be no ex post facto laws. Ex post facto laws refer to laws that punish someone after the fact. So say tomorrow they passed a law banning cell phones. They could not punish people who had used cell phones yesterday. That would be an ex post facto law. So any law that's passed, if you broke that law before it was passed, you could not be punished for it. They also banned that there would be religious qualifications for holding office. That means they can't say you have to be Christian to be elected. That was one of the first indications that they believed in a separation of church and state. There also had to be strict evidence for conviction of treason. So they actually have to prove that you committed it. And they gave you a right to a trial by jury in criminal cases. Those were the rights guaranteed in the actual body of our Constitution. But they left a lot out that some questioned. There was no specific mention of freedom of speech or expression, no rights of the accused. So some argued that even though they did address some individual rights in the Constitution to make sure that the government didn't get too powerful and to limit the government, some argued that it didn't get specific enough. So there was still some conflict there. So that's basically how they moved forward with our new Constitution. But then they had to get it ratified. So, ratifying the Constitution means getting it formally approved. And there were two sides that were arguing about ratification. The Federalists wanted to ratify the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists did not. They were against it. The Federalists were the large landowners, the wealthy merchants, and the professionals. They lived in more urban areas. The Anti-Federalists were the farmers, the shopkeepers, the laborers, more the regular working class people. The Federalists loved the new Constitution because it weakened those state governments. It made a stronger national government that could be more decisive in solving problems. It used an indirect election of officials, like it used the Electoral College to choose the president, and state representatives elected the senators, so that they could kind of have a check on the people who were not very informed at the time. They used longer terms of office. It was a lot more government by the elite, and they really just didn't expect that there would be many violations of individual liberties. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, did not like the new Constitution because they wanted a stronger state government to make sure the state could defend the rights of the people. They didn't want the strong national government that would come in and possibly take away their rights. They would have preferred to have a direct election of officials to give more power to the people, shorter terms of office so they could vote people out if they weren't doing well. They wanted more rule by the common man, and they preferred that we would have had strengthened protections of individual liberties. They wanted a Bill of Rights that would say that you had the freedom of speech and certain protections. So this big debate was going on back and forth. The Federalists were more organized, though, and they came out with the Federalist Papers. It was a collection of 85 articles, kind of like propaganda pieces, written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, all important members of the Constitutional Convention. James Madison having been kind of the direct author, the father of our Constitution. And they put it out under a pen named Publius, referring to the people, to defend the Constitution. And you need to know about these three papers especially. The 10th Federalist Paper, number 10, warned about factions. Factions are like groups of people who group around the same issue, kind of the predecessor of political parties and interest groups. They warned that factions are detrimental to democracy because they kind of hijack the power, but they're unavoidable in democracy at the same time because people are naturally going to organize around issues. You need to realize that. Number 10 warned about factions. Federalist Paper number 51 said the importance of separation of powers, because if we have three branches of government that are separate powers, then we won't have tyranny because they will, make sure one branch doesn't get too powerful. And Federalist Paper number 78 talked about the powers of the judiciary and how the judiciary is an important check that people's rights aren't being violated. And this was the first hint at the power of judicial review, where the courts should be able to declare laws unconstitutional. So these Federalist Papers were basically propaganda papers put out by the Federalists to promote the Constitution, and it was very successful. The Anti-Federalists were not as organized, so basically they were leaning towards getting the support to get the Constitution ratified in most states. A big issue, though, that was stopping a lot of places, especially in big states like New York and Virginia, was this Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists wanted to add 10 amendments to the Constitution, at least, to address their concerns about the lack of basic liberties. So what they decided to do was propose a compromise. The Federalists said, although we don't think it's necessary because we think if you write down specific rights, then some will be left out and it'll cause controversy, they said that we will pass a Bill of Rights document after the ratification. So that was kind of the compromise to get more of the Anti-Federalists to support the Constitution. So ultimately, ratification did occur. The Federalists asked that each state ratify the Constitution, each state convention, and not state legislatures, because they knew the state legislatures probably wouldn't support it because that would take away their power. So they had these conventions in each state. Delaware was the first convention to ratify the Constitution on December 7th of 1787. New Hampshire came ninth, which was the most significant because it took 9 states to ratify. But it's important to know that New York and Virginia were really the most significant states of conventions because they had the most people there. And if New York and Virginia hadn't ratified, then they probably would have fallen apart. So the Constitution was ratified even though the Anti-Federalists tried to resist it.